Good afternoon, good evening, everyone out there. Thanks for tuning in for Takes Action Session 3 today. We are joined by both deans at the California College of the Arts and University of Toronto, John H. Daniels Faculty of Architecture. We'll pass it over to them for welcomes and introductions. Rob.
Hello, and welcome to the Daniels Faculty 2020-21 Talks and Lecture Series, which is entitled Resolution and Agencies. My name is Rob Wright. I am the Dean at the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto, and we are really delighted to continue our cross-coastal and international collaboration with the California College of the Arts, and I'm hoping we can actually do more stuff together. First, I wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Daniels honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Thank you. I'd like to welcome Keith Krumwiede, Dean at the CCA, and our collaborator on this three-part event.
Thank you, Rob, and welcome everyone. I'm very happy to continue our collaboration with the Daniels faculty and ORO editions with this third and final session of Bracket Takes Action. This event is part of the Fall 2020 CCA Architecture Lecture Series titled Remaking, through which we are bringing important contemporary thinkers and makers to CCA to reflect upon the work we must do now to co-imagine a just and equitable future. You can learn more about our programs, including our next event, by visiting our new content channel at scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. Our next event, next Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific time, is a lecture by Giovanna Barassi, director of the other CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, who will reflect upon and interpret the findings of the Urbanism Beyond Corona Instagram series, curated by two of our CCA research labs, the Urban Works Agency and History Theory X. At CCA, it's also customary to acknowledge the land on which we learn and work. CCA campuses are located in Huichin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples, as does the University of Toronto, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and also wish to pay our respects to local elders, including those on the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Now I'll pass it off to your hosts, Neeraj Bhatia and Mason White.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Rob. And thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Neeraj Bhatia. I'm an associate professor at CCA and also founder of the design practice, The Open Workshop. Today we'll be having our fourth and final launch for Bracket Takes Action, which is the fourth issue in the Bracket series. Today I'll be hosting alongside my co-editor, Mason White, who is a professor at the University of Toronto and partner at Lateral Office. So before jumping in, I just want to have some shout outs. There's been a really amazing team behind these events as well as behind the Bracket project. So thank you so much to CCA, Daniels, as well as AR&D for co-sponsoring this event today. And thank you, Keith, Rob, and Gordon Goff for their support of this project. Thank you as well to the Graham Foundation, who has been a consistent supporter of the Bracket project since its inception, as well as media partner Reconnect and our graphic designers, Haller Brun. Thank you to all the contributors and speakers for being here today. And last but not least, thank you to the amazing organizational team at Daniels and CCA, including Nini, Sarah, Aiden, and Hannah.
So as you might know, each issue of Bracket addresses an urgent contemporary theme on architecture, environment, and digital culture. This fourth issue addresses the notion of action in spatial practice and the complex interplay between politics, society, and space. Hannah Arendt's 1958 treatise, The Human Condition, cites action as one of the three tenets, along with labor and work, of the Vita active or active life. Action, she writes, is a necessary catalyst for, quote, the human condition of plurality, quote, which is an expression of the common public and the distinct individual. However, more than 50 years later, we appear in a multitude of ways. Therefore, the role of spatial practice in relation to forms of action also needs to be re-examined. Spatial practice's role in anticipating, resisting, organizing, or absorbing action has been broadly challenged by shifts in notions of publicness, social practice, and roles of government. How and where to act is increasingly complex as it requires new techniques and assemblies to reflect the tendencies of distinct factions and their associated values.
So Takes Action emerged from conversations between Mason and I going all the way back to 2016, reacting to events such as the Arab Spring, to Occupy Wall Street, to the Umbrella Movement. And these were all forms of action that used the space of the city as a theater for assembly. 2020, which seems very, very far from 2016, presents an ever wider range of conditions for design to respond to action. And we wanted to probe all the different ways that action was emerging, and we asked how design might incite forms of action and socio-political action specifically. These forms of action span from the domestic realm to public space, from online to offline, from confrontation to subtle recalibrations.
So working with an editorial board, we collected these 36 or so contributions on the theme of Takes Action into 6 sub-themes: reaction, counteraction, interaction, faction, inaction, and retroaction. These 6 themes reveal the diversity of issues, methods, and most importantly, relevancy to the topic of this topic to designers and design thinkers. So this 3rd session we're hosting here today is meant to center around 2 of these topics. The first one, called Inactions, includes ways of acting by not acting, from squatting and loitering to waiting lands in particular contexts. Inaction has proven to be an effective way to sidestep, undermine, or identify loopholes within a given system. Or how might design engage socio-political change with the least means necessary?
The other topic in the final chapter of the book is entitled RetroAction. These are projects and texts that center on how we understand the past. These projects and articles foreground the contemporary role of memory, memorials, and commemoration on our understanding and valuing of giving place to history. How do forms of action participate in the registration of memory and foster a sense of historic recollection? So to discuss these topics, as well as action more generally being our final event today, we have this amazing group of contributors to the book, and I'll introduce them now. And I'll introduce them in the order that they will be presenting today. So joining us all the way from Europe is Lucía Jalón Oyarzun, who's the head of research at the ALICE Laboratory, which stands for the Atelier de la Conception de l'Espace of the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne. David Eugene Moon is an adjunct assistant professor at Columbia GSAP and partner of the office NHDM. Jill Desimini is an associate professor of landscape architecture at Harvard GSD. And finally, Ersela Kripa and Stephen Mueller are both professors at Texas Tech University, and together they are partners in the firm Agency.
And up here now you see a screen capture of Oro Publishers' generous 30% off sale, which is extending, I think, for this last week here to purchase the book at a discounted rate. Thanks to ARD for offering that. I think we're going to put a link to that in the chat so everyone can access it. So we're ready to begin the presentations. As Neeraj said, we're going to have 4 presentations thanks to our 5 presenters today. And Lucía is going to start us off. So we're ready whenever you are. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I share the screen. I guess it's all right and you all see it, no?
It's perfect.
Well, before I go into this kind of retroactive exercise that the proposal led me to, I want to thank Neeraj and Mason for putting together this amazing book and organizing this session. The book is really extraordinary and provocative, and I think that it cannot appear in a more necessary moment. So thank you for following on this and not despairing and making it happen. And also, of course, I want to thank the California College of the Arts and the Daniels Faculty at the University of Toronto for hosting this event and making this possible. And so I go now into what I've called a retroactive exercise, because it truly has taken me back some years ago to when I was in New York at Columbia University's libraries doing research for my doctoral thesis. And because it was then that this text took shape. And so going back to it, it has allowed me to see how it is still active, it is still present, effective within my current research and worries, but also how the issues that it treated, the spatial production of a de facto segregated people, keeps being determinant for our present, in the sense that it extends and makes it bigger, makes our present bigger, offering us more strategic and instrumental possibilities. And that's in fact the key idea of what I would like to convey within this short intervention: the need to see the past not just as a cosmetic memorialistic drapery for our present actions, but as an operative extension of our own present, understood as field of operations and active repertoire of actions. So I will try to explain this. I won't go too deep into the article because reading will probably be a more rewarding experience than me butchering it quickly right now. But suffice it to say that I departed from this extraordinary photograph that you are seeing now, taken by Jack Manning in Harlem in the late 30s. It shows the people gathering for the Elks Parade in the streets of Harlem. And it allowed me to enter into the spatial production of a population segregated not by law, like in the Jim Crow South, but by de facto forms articulated through perfectly accepted and even hailed practices of capitalist dispossession, practices still quite present today. And I followed that photograph and what it showed, and I followed through some big apartments in Harlem that were divided once, twice, thrice to hold as many families as possible, through rooftops and fire staircases to see how the inside and outside of the city got entangled in a fertile way to produce a political commons capable of unsettling the officiality of politics and representation. So again, for more detail, I refer you to the text, but here I want to highlight two notions that organize the article in order to arrive to that idea of history as operative and strategic extension of the present, as that repertoire of practices that I was mentioning. And the first notion comes from a text from the writer Ralph Ellison called Harlem is Nowhere. And it is that nowhere that interests me, because I think that nowhere is that what tells us of a spatiality without location, a performed spatiality that simply is, that it is not defined by legal codes or demarcated by precise lines, but that it is made and thread through the bodies it entangles and the commons it creates, the languages, the practices, the affects, because that idea of the affect is quite important. The philosopher Spinoza, for instance, defined a political community as that organization of bodies linked not only by reason, but most importantly, by a common affect. So this nowhere speaks then of a performed, embodied community, an affective extension defined by the actions and inactions of the bodies threading the material articulation of the neighborhood with its built environment, those rooftops, those apartments, the stoops, etc. But defining forms of spatiality that go way beyond that built environment. Also, this nowhere echoes Herman Melville's Bartleby when he says, "I would prefer not to." And I mean this in the sense that just as those words, the nowhere of Ellison opens up a space of indetermination, of pure potentiality, of expression and presence that resists being pinned down and that resists representation. And then the second notion that I want to highlight is more of a question. And it is what happens when, instead of the canonical reading of the human body that has articulated the history of the architectural discipline to be read with capital letters, we understand as El Greco, the Greek painter from the 17th century, that there is no one singular body. There are many bodies. That's what he noted down in his Vitruvius copy. Those are, in fact, his notes. He was discussing with the text and really arguing like, no, there is no one body. There are many different bodies. And so, like those present in Manning's photograph that we were seeing at the beginning, there are many bodies. And so we understand that we need to consider a body not so much defined by its proportions and measures, but by its effects. And with this, I mean by its affective reach, by its ability to touch and to be touched at a distance. That is, understand a body by the now cliched Spinozist question saying, wondering what a body can do. So when we analyze the architectural production of those many bodies defined by their affective reach and extension, which is what elsewhere I've termed a minor architecture, we realize that the architectural actions of those overflowing, distorted, noisy, laughing bodies are always entangled with that kind of nowhereness, if we can invent that term, because they work directly with those potentialities. They operate with presence before representation. They operate with ambiguity before identity. A minor architecture, after all, is always dealing with how the present is always surrounded by this fog of fuzzy presences, or in the words of David Lapoujade, of minor existences. Minor existences that express a plural temporality. There are many past and many futures entangled with the present, interacting with it, opening up possibilities, blocking actions, pointing paths, organizing matter, which means there are many past and many futures touching, shaping, disposing the material organization of our commons, the spaces of our political constitution. And so with these two notions in mind, and in order to finish with this retroactive exercise, I want to arrive to that idea of history as an exploration of presences within our current field of operations, of history as a strategic repertoire of practices. What I was trying to do back in the time, I hadn't finished my PhD back then, was to trace and understand instances where those many bodies and those nowheres came together to unsettle traditional notions of the architectural, of stable organizations of power and politics, of clear instances of representation. All in all, what I wanted to do is to study the existing conflict between the spatial forms of the exception and the spatial forms of the body in revolt. Thus, I was studying that regime of de facto segregation in the north of the United States, but also the de jure segregated regime of the Jim Crow South, and how the nowhere bodies organized there and unsettled the lines of their subjection, from Rosa Parks to the sit-ins and other everyday protests. And I went further back in time to study how the night had become a nowhere for alternative political practices as light and police became entangled throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Also how the practices of the Cour des Miracles in Paris and the restrictions and built enclosures of the Hôpital Général, where the poor and the homeless of the city were confined, were constituting each other. I tried to sum up, to create a genealogy of those minor practices I called minor architectures. I did it following the practices of those minor bodies as affective entities, trying to expand the current repertoire of spatial tools, of operational strategies for architecture. And doing this, I wasn't trying to freeze these historical situations as isolated reference or romantic images of revolt or objects to memorialize in an abstract way. I understood, on the contrary, that there is an affective continuity between those moments and ours, that the materiality of those situations is present and active in so many ways and still influencing our present that we need to take that into account. That those nowheres are ingrained and effective in our moment. That the plurality of past times is still configuring our present, touching, placing, and quite frequently even acting out our bodies. These plural times are architectural forces within the present that we need to take into account, work with them, operate with them today. And this was more or less the kind of mental exercise that your really kind invitation brought me to. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the next interventions and our moments of exchange.
Great, thank you so much, Lucía. Next, we're going to have David Moon present.
Thank you, Mason and Neeraj, and hopefully you can see my screen in a second here. So I'd like to start a little bit by talking about how the research came about by living in Holland and working there. And it's already been, I think, a few years, as Mason mentioned, since I did the project and the work. But in the end, maybe it'll be interesting to frame it in terms of the broader relevance, and especially all of the things that are happening now. But I'd like to start with this moment between 1971 and 2010, when the Dutch government mandated an urban experiment in reprogramming its cities. In dealing with the crisis of an overwhelming amount of vacant spaces, aging structures, and an incompatible set of needs, the citizens of Holland were legally allowed to squat buildings that were vacant for more than a year if a user could enter a space bringing only a bed, desk, and a chair. And the results of this new and unique set of conditions were often bizarre anomalies and contested preconceived notions in architecture and urbanism, including programming, pre-described functionalism, form making, as well as ownership models and the boundaries of individual rights in the city. Young middle-class professionals and recent college graduates were suddenly able to occupy entire floors of empty office buildings. Vacant blocks became temporary hotels. New centers of subversive culture spontaneously formed and institutionalized. And many of these occupancies flourished undocumented until about 2010, despite strong public demonstrations and student strikes in major cities throughout the Netherlands. Dutch citizens creatively reconceptualized and manipulated the existing urban infrastructure to their needs, partaking in untested modes of spatial organization on a national scale. It was the Dutch Supreme Court's ruling under the House Rules in 1971 that established the squatters as legal occupants protected from forceful intrusions. And as described by conservative Bastiaan van Wout in the book, The Black Book of Squatting from 2008, the opponents of squatting continue to argue for the unconditional rights of private owners. So you can think of this analogy where your neighbor has the belief that they have access to your car because of its underuse. So that was one of the kind of strong arguments, in addition to maybe avoiding the real problem of housing through these kind of additional measures. And then conversely, there was the White Book of Squatting, which represents the opposite position, which argues for the rights of the individual with a narrative similar to Henri Lefebvre and David Harvey's right to the city, and furthermore for their civic responsibilities to protect such basic rights. And the debate became even more relevant because the abundance of vacant spaces and the estimated 7-year waiting list at the time for social housing. So at stake was the city's right to control private property and the responsibility to regulate its spaces. But beyond this ethical debate, there was also these associations and portraitures of the squatters who were sometimes described as undesirables or marginalized people. And interestingly, they were also thought of as the creators of culture and the positive actors in these dysfunctional parts of the city. So with the legalization of squatting, these experiments in urbanism became available to the Dutch general public, who no longer had to stick to these normal approvals, public consensus, administrative procedures, suddenly having the freedom to explore autonomy in redesigning their own city, similar to the descriptions by architects Alfredo Brillenberg, Hubert Kompner, and the sociologist Richard Sennett, and prompted a kind of reprogrammable city that did not involve the high modernist singular vision for a perfectly planned and structured, compartmentalized static city. In contrast, the Dutch squat offered a more dynamic model of the city that had no hierarchical framework or plan, and was constrained only by the immediate resources of a marginalized or particularly adventurous public. So as a whole, the degree of dynamism as well as the limitations of the Dutch squat imply speculative urban megastructural proposals like architects Joner Friedman, Cedric Price, and Eckhard Schultz-Felix, or maybe even Archizum's infinite exterior-interior multi-material and mirrored models of weak modernity. So the squats became representative of this kind of utopian ambition for plug-in and self-empowered projects where the users were also the creators. So these squats were the site of individual or group experimentation and played a role in adjusting the mismatched demands of a population and the existing city. These spontaneous programmatic experiments by the squatters sometimes resulted in strange scenes or seemingly inappropriate program to space-informed relationships, such as seen here, a single occupant in a tower, both puzzling and inciting kind of the imagination. But these unlikely scenarios challenge notions of the typical program, allowing for incredible mismatches in type, form, and use. And due to their nature, these squats sometimes became inevitably centers of voyeuristic spectacles, as well as touristic and eventually financial interests, tightly integrated into the various systems of the formal city. So this is probably a good example to show of an early squat, which was an abandoned grain silo, which eventually became occupied by artists and ad hoc groups, and is located across Amsterdam along the I River. And it was first squatted in '89 and by a group of 100 inhabitants who traded skills and services to meet basic everyday needs. But by the late '90s, it became a kind of acclaimed performance venue, as well as housing cafes, galleries, bakeries, and actually became quite a tourist destination, a kind of alternative tourism site in Amsterdam. And combined with this monumental iconography and programmatic diversity, the silo became a landmark in the city, and so much so that it was declared a national monument in '96. And so that the silo squatters were evicted eventually, and a condo was put in its place. But while these types of squatting situations were important for housing or alternative housing, they also act as highly visible forms of dissent and resistance against conventions and hegemonies in Dutch society. In the early '70s, here's an image of a protest at Newmarkt where they were trying to prevent the demolition of their own housing due to a planned new highway and subway line. And so it's interesting that maybe you could think of it as what sociologist Hans Prutt would call conservational squatting, but also an active representation. And so these protests succeeded, and while many of the squatted areas in Amsterdam were eventually replaced with low-income housing, I think it's an interesting example of how these squatters permanently affected the future of the city, and an example of role reversal and societal power. So coming to an end here, thinking about the culmination, it speaks to a larger conflict in Holland about a resurgent conservative political party and the changing demographics of the population, which included an ever-growing minority of immigrants and the lack of support for integration and cultural assimilation. So after these 40 years, you see a real erosion of liberal policies, and that helped to kind of famously create this tolerant society. And especially after the 2008 economic crash, you see dramatic shifts away from support from public institutions and programs, and a growing intolerance for its immigrant populations. So coming to an end here, finally in October 1st, 2010, squatting was officially banned, and the decision was met with mass riots, protests, and a national petition. And the squatters who remained were subject to up to 1 to 2 years in prison. And what used to be something like 20,000 squat sites in the '80s dwindled to only about 23 a few years after. So in thinking of, you know, the kind of consequences and the kind of postscript, maybe it's nice just to bring this last project into view, NDSM, which is known as a self-made city in Amsterdam, where the original squatters of the silo won a competition or a proposal to transform an existing chip foundry into this kind of city in a box. And it's maybe one of many different progeny where an informal system is reproduced with formal processes. Located across the river, it's maybe reminiscent of these aforementioned utopian megastructure projects that were never realized. And, you know, obviously it's much more realistic, grittier interpretation, but it has this large three-dimensional infrastructure where each individual artist or owner had their own rights to design their own unit or plot and had a kind of responsibility to the municipality. So like other squats, it was incredibly diverse and inclusive and organized along city streets, internalized blocks, and public squares. And for me, really pressing the questions between the hard distinction between the formal and the informal, and the programmatically determinate and indeterminate. So here we are at the end, and I can tell you that many of the remnants and resultant networks, institutions, and post-squat projects remain. But in retrospect, this idea of a reprogrammable city maybe has many different interpretations. And what's important for me is not a return to the past or a fetishization of the aesthetics of informality, but instead to think about program as a moderator on the one hand between the civic desires and aspirations at the time, and on the other hand, sort of the on-the-ground realities, and to move away from idea about universal flexibility or total informalism. So that's pretty much it. And I just in the context of today, the core issues for me, thinking about inequity in housing and evictions, forthcoming perhaps, political atmospheres of today and their beginnings in Europe, potentially. Thinking about control and how we think about the city, and this really provocative idea by the editors of action through inaction. Thank you.
Thank you, David. It's worth noting actually that David has two contributions in the book. Another one called No Stop, which picks up maybe some of those ideas in project form. There's already some really exciting conversations happening between Lucia's presentation and yours about minor architecture, minor bodies, users and creators, but we'll have Jill, Ersela, and Stephen to go. So stay with us. Jill, I think we're shifting scales now actually a little bit. So Jill, we'll pass the screen over to you.
Awesome, thank you. It's great to be here. I want to thank you, Neeraj and Mason, for the invite, and to Daniels and CCA for hosting. And I'm excited to celebrate the Bracket Takes Action project with you and offer a few reflections. I think, like my fellow colleagues, this is work that I did a little bit ago, but that I have definitely come back to recently. And I have to admit that while I'm here to talk about inaction, I'm conflicted about the word, at least on the surface, as I feel at this moment, we should be all about action, about figuring out ways we can act meaningfully as citizens to dismantle the systemic failures of our society and to take care of each other, from quarantining to protesting. And as designers, to take apart our disciplinary biases, to tackle our complicity in the shaping of unjust space. So perhaps, like David, I take comfort in the expanded definitions that this book offers for means of action, and in particular, in my case, for means of inaction, and that inaction is not doing anything, but rather is sidestepping, undermining, finding loopholes. It's about engaging socio-political change with the least means necessary. And so my work aims to engage and transform physical landscapes in places of market failure, to sort of engage fully, but with limited resource, or in other words, to take the prompt to act with the least means necessary. So these are places where land is readily abandoned and readily available, where properties lay unclaimed by humans, and it is not possible to give these properties away, much less sell them. Some are adopted willingly by neighbors, but others lay fallow, caught without market value in an unsettling, if reproductive, pause. Abrupt action has occurred, but future action is uncertain. And so in these cases, the waiting is involuntary. Our US system of property valuation depends on the real estate market, and the real estate market is built to maximize profit and promote growth. Where value is concerned, location matters above all, with housing prices being more susceptible to decline than housing quantity. In fact, the behavior of the housing market can help explain the persistence of declining prices. Because housing is durable, a decrease in demand leads to a drop in price rather than a decrease in quantity, which means that the housing stock stays constant despite the market change. And for this reason, decline is not the opposite of growth. Where possible, houses are built quickly when demand for them increases, but they remain largely extant when demand for them drops. And to compensate for the discrepancies in supply and demand, housing prices drop. And if housing prices descend to levels that are below the cost of construction, it can be inferred that the population of the surrounding has already also declined. And as capital becomes more global, and here a shout out to Josh Aker's work, the condition of decline is furthered through predatory lending and speculation, where companies offer subprime loans and purchase multiple properties and hold them in disrepair, evicting tenants. And here the waiting is voluntary for the capital holders and involuntary for the community at large. When formerly valued property loses its market value, all the freedoms of land ownership, the security of solid investment, and the freedoms of use become burdens. And the burden either rests with the owner, who still holds the title but cannot control the greater economic, social, political, or environmental systems affecting its future value, or it's transferred to a bank or municipality through processes of foreclosure. And if you're ever in that process, don't ever leave your house, because the bank is so crappy that they don't actually foreclose, they just threaten it. And so while this system is producing decline across the country in neighborhoods and entire cities, the responses still bank on returning the property to private ownership. The vision to rebuild literally is through the same market, even if we recognize that our past methods of building and investing produce racial injustice and carbon emission. Instead of legal, regulatory, and spatial property reform, the imaginary is one of the status quo, or perhaps either regression. So I knew this was going to be a good week for this conversation personally when I left my house, not once, but twice, to find this working AC unit on the corner, and to witness two cars pull up simultaneously to take this unit. It looks almost new, one driver said to the other. It does. And as I moved on, they negotiated who would be the lucky owner. And you are probably asking me right now, what does a working AC unit have to do with property reform? And so here I'm actually going to read from the end of my piece in Bracket Takes Action. So sorry to give it all away before you maybe have had a chance to dive into it. But when market forces vanish, land typically goes from being a symbol of freedom to being that other sort of free, the free that is met with suspicion. People are leery of land that becomes at no cost. What's the catch? But in the case of abandoned land, despite any suspicion, it still performs. Abandoned land is like that electronic device left curbside with a note attached to it saying it works. That one didn't have a note, but anyways, many people walk by and choose not to take the free item, some because they truly don't want it, but others because there's risk associated, coupled with imperfect information. There's no way to test the device in situ, and there are questions about why someone would give it away for free, why not sell it if it works, why not keep it? And there is supposition that goods given away for free could be damaged, only when the context of their situation is made clear, as in samples in a grocery store, is that which is free embraced. And clearly I wrote this pre-pandemic because who knows if there'll ever be samples in the grocery store again. But further, there's a stigma associated with taking or relying on free goods. Being able to negotiate a deal is seen as clever, but taking things without paying, especially if it's done frequently, can be viewed as dependence. In this case, free is no longer associated with independence, but rather a lack of financial freedom. Free is no longer a choice. So to return to the electronic device like curbside, there are times when the advertising is true, that when plugged in, it turns on, the risk pays off. And there's a relevant analogy with the abandoned urban land, that this land works too. It has ecological value and social potential, attributes not usually valued by the market, but important for its urban function, as we've seen in the previous presentations. The land suffers from imperfect information, where a negative reading is tainting its perception, through visual decoding and data support, as evidenced by outreach and pilot initiatives, efforts of data collection, shifting perspectives of spontaneous practice, and evidence-based studies of positive externalities of land care efforts, arguments can be made for the inclusion of this land within the urban fabric as a fully functioning, highly flexible connective tissue. Yet there's another tension with free urban land, because much of that land is being transferred from private to public hands. And currently, there's not a viable design or economic model for this type of unsettlement. Both taxation and public funding depend on human occupation of land. And beyond pure economics, there's a tendency to view this transformation as regression rather than part of a reproductive cycle. Production is linear, unidirectional towards growth, and while overall growth occurs with this ever-expansive urbanization, some land is left behind in the wake of capital's process, and this land cannot simply be thrown away. There's an imperative to find a way to restructure the land market, to remove the stigma of the free, to see the potential in other forms of care, to provide the information necessary to convince both public and private entities to take action and permanently adopt the unwanted lands. In other words, don't wait for development, is what I'm saying. Go ahead, plug that land back into the city. And so while you may recognize that this is not the ending, so fortunately I didn't give anything away by reading it to you. Instead, it's the beginning of a project on action. And so maybe it's where I've taken it. So here I want to return to the theme of inaction. And you may think that my call to plug the land back in is naive, especially with the comments I've started with on how the current property system works. And yes, clearly, if this was easy, it would be happening more. But I want to say that I'm admittedly hopeful and that I have seen plenty of land plugged back in without development and working. And so here, maybe again, it's useful to recall the inaction of sidestepping and squatting, of just using the land as a means to show its social and ecological potential. As a form of activism that can demand reform, that can redirect the urge to simply place the land back into any old private hands, or to use it as a base for any old building. Land banks have noted that land cycles back through, that it may move into private hands, but it comes back out, or stays in the purgatory of speculation. But until we see something different, we continue. So these slides passing by point to active inactions, the potential that move beyond the false dichotomy of weeds or development, and leave us with ideas to instrumentalize, to transcend the surprisingly resource-intensive yet culturally palatable mowed lawn existing in a scattered and involuntary limbo. So with that, thank you. And I look forward to the discussion, and I'm clearly in the basement under some cute kids, so hopefully it's not too distracting.
Thanks so much, Jill. That was fantastic, and great to see that back-to-back with David's presentation, looking at kind of questions of value, other forms of value, and reappropriation from the system. Last but not least, I want to hand it over to Stephen and Ursula to discuss their project research and findings on a pipeline. So I will pass it over to you guys.
All right, thank you. Oh, started from the end, sorry about this. Here it is, all of it. In 1 second. So today we thank you so much for having us. We're so excited to share this, to have this conversation, and we will talk about the Keystone Pipeline at the transcontinental scale and inaction as a form of resistance. Transformations in domestic energy policy in the past 10 to 15 years have instigated a new era of resource-based urbanism throughout the United States, fundamentally reshaping relationships between property, resources, and domestic space in newly contested territories. The Obama administration's focus on energy independence internalized the geologic reshaping of territories from the edges of empire outside of the nation into the domestic interior. Embodied most visibly in the proliferation of hydraulic fracturing, sites across the Great Plains and Western states, paradigmatic shifts in energy extraction technologies and transport logistics have conspired to inscribe volatile intersections between competing interests within newly domestic geographies. We've been questioning historical conceptions of energy infrastructure as a condition for growth, detailing its current capacity as a conduit for new and emerging services, and speculating on future infrastructural logics that can act as a site and productive testbed for competing geospatial and geopolitical agendas. These national policies have opened new sites to energy exploration, enabling speculative investment in energy infrastructure by private companies and a booming market for jobs in the energy extraction sector. This moment in our energy policy could transform our place in the world and is already shaping the cities in which we live. Split estates, kill zones, man camps, and carbon cemeteries are but a few examples of the emerging petro-industrial spatial typologies whose very nomenclature indicates the uneasy and often conflictual methods by which these transitions occur. We've been looking at the intersections of various energy territories and their impact on urbanism in the US, including the construction and expansion of wind power plants, of solar power plants as well, and really their intersections with emerging threats, and looking at blackout risk areas and oil spill locations and how they all sort of come together.
And this really collapses in this transcontinental territory of the Keystone XL pipeline, or the KXL pipeline. Across all of these contested territories, this project or this initiative really stands out. So the proposed Keystone XL or KXL pipeline cuts this definitive transect, representing a newly minted intercontinental territory and a site of potential existential and ecological risk. KXL is a proposed and partially completed oil pipeline that originates in Alberta, Canada, meant to be now completed by the year 2023 unless a new administration changes its course. If completed, the KXL pipeline will span 1,700 miles in length, making it one of the longest oil pipelines in the world. KXL will conduct crude oil extracted from the Albertan tar sands area to advanced modern refineries on the southern coast of Texas, capable of handling the new product. A majority of this output would actually be exported then to global markets. So the US is really just allowing the flow of extraterritorial resources across its borders, in effect producing a form of what we're calling an international easement. The pipeline itself is comprised of multiple sites whose sheer scale can alter the fortunes of nations and the climate across the globe. Like this tar sands extraction site in Canada near its origin, 5 times the size of Washington, DC and growing, which will unleash one of the largest known oil reserves, potentially ushering in a new age of energy independence, national security, and ecological existential risk in the US. This contested territory enables spaces for action within its blind spots. The top-down instantiation of strategic energy industrial spatial protocols promote a type of productive disequilibrium where the transect misaligns with existing structures and intersects adversarial population centers. The transpolitical territory of the line is far-flung and overextended, leading to uncertainty, confusion, and relative oversight in its construction, its maintenance, and in response to actions against it. As it crosses juridical and political boundaries, the pipeline constitutes a new territory of misaligned and often uncoordinated interests. Here you see our mapping of the different protests against it. A range of actors and competing interests are unearthed and subsequently drawn together, including company executives, construction crews, local law enforcement, property owners, and activists. The line is continuously negotiated and constantly in flux. The proposed segment in Nebraska has been redrawn multiple times, for instance, in response to competing interests, largely due to concern over its transgression through a major aquifer, the Ogallala Aquifer, one of the nation's largest supplies of drinking water, and the ecology of the Nebraskan sand hills. Discussions with multiple property owners, including sovereign Native American tribes, have resulted in the line's recalibration and significant rerouting, and is leading actually to many of its delays. While the deployment of seemingly regular and innocuous infrastructures across such a large and heterogeneous territory would attempt to produce a predictable stability, it has produced instead a new public realm. and novel new constituencies coincident with the polarization and amplification of existing stakeholders. In its realization through conflict, the territory moves from its conception as a prescriptive artifact of making to a pervasive, responsive condition of acting, enabling a range of creative spatial practices from the bottom up. Obstructionist and interventionist spatial practices abound throughout the transect. An anti-pipeline coalition in Nebraska, for instance, built this energy barn in the pipeline's right-of-way as a type of didactic spatial demonstration of the pipeline's many failings. The project models an alternative use of clean energies in the hopes of exploiting the backlash and negative publicity when the highly visible project is demolished, because it is in fact in the right-of-way for the line. The Rosebud Sioux tribe built what they call a spirit camp in the pipeline's path near Ideal, South Dakota, while the Ponca tribe planted sacred corn varietals near Nearly, Nebraska, similarly problematizing the line's construction before it begins. This is an example, an image of the voluntary evacuation zone, a 100-foot sort of corridor on either side of the line, in which particular threats emerge because of potential increase of spill risk. And this is a visualization of the easement as it passes through some of the geographies near one of the final geographies we'll talk about in sort of north and eastern Texas, where it passes through not only urban areas, but also sort of pine forests. In 2012, a variety of resistance camps were organized and promoted by a group called the Tar Sands Blockade, a coalition of activists who believed in what they called peaceful, sustained, direct action as a primary means of stopping the construction of the KXL. In September of 2012, founders of the organization, many of whom were veterans of the Occupy movement, established what they called a tree village in the piney woods of East Texas. They occupied an area the size of a city block above a planned 50-foot wide easement for over 2.5 months. The camps, or tree villages, opportunistically exploited the uncertainty and the emerging legal framework surrounding the pipeline's construction, creating a productive space for action within the recently redefined legal boundaries of property and ownership. If Bill McKibben's well-known environmentalist rhetoric had established the pipeline as a geography capable of galvanizing national attention, the direct actions in East Texas in 2012 were an experiment of KXL's capacity to serve as a site for sustained action.
The Tree Village draws on and expands technological legacies of civil disobedience and protest encampments, adapting these strategies to the particularities of the sites in East Texas and the organizer's own experience rigging high-wire circus acts. We developed this drawing in our office with Garrett House, who was a former student at WashU when we were developing this essay. Our panoramic section included in the bracket InAction section attempts to narrate and collect the various forms of action in this territory. Lessons learned from experiments in tree sitting activism, rock climbing, and more common arborist equipment and techniques enabled the protesters to construct a minimal and flexible presence in the path of the proposed pipeline. The protesters used the airspace of the easement as an extra legal territory. By occupying the trees of the easement, they prevent potential bulldozing of those trees and impede the construction of the pipeline. The village has a sophisticated level of development for such a short-lived inhabitation. Described as a web of tree houses, structures, and pulleys, the village is a series of aerial platforms 70 feet above the ground, including a tree house. A small outbuilding serves as the headquarters with a communal kitchen nearby capable of feeding 50 protesters. A makeshift shower is rigged for public bathing. Tree sitters are supported by a band of support staff, including on and off-site medical, legal, and media assistance. Training staff holds informational sessions for newcomers or Prusignauts on Prusignauts and foot loops before they climb into position. So to conclude, in January 2013, the protesters agreed to TransCanada's terms prohibiting certain actions within the pipeline easement, including, quote, chaining, shackling, binding, or attaching any person's body or any other object, article, or mechanism to stop, halt, or arrest Keystone construction. the limiting terms of the lawsuit, the state sponsor control of information to support corporate activity, and the suggested reclassification of coordinated direct action and civil disobedience as analogous to terrorist activity, all serve as haunting precedents for future actions in contested territories of the sort. They're indicative of a general trend towards what we describe in our book as the new forms of military urbanism, whereby security protocols developed in military settings by occupying forces that are abroad are brought to bear on the daily operations of the domestic homeland. The defensive posturing of our energy territory, developed in the name of domestic security and redoubled in the face of obstructionist practices, has recast domestic constituents as extra state actors and criminal entities. This belies the inherent vulnerability of our energy landscape, which fuels a politics of fear and a pragmatics of response. Thank you.
Thank you, Ersela, Stephen, and thanks to all of you for those amazing presentations. It's really nice to see the work years later after editing, but also to see some new thoughts on the work itself. I'm going to jump in just because we have the pleasure of having more of the articles today focused on the concept of inaction. And I'm really happy, Jill, that you mentioned that inaction is not doing nothing, that we got to be very clear. It's a kind of a way of finding loopholes or subverting a system. And I'm just curious if you've thought about the operative kind of mechanisms within inaction for your projects. And in particular, one thing that I see linking across the projects is the act of reappropriation. So I see this, Lucía, for instance, in your article, you talk about the balconies as, you know, a space that becomes reappropriated on that threshold between the private interior and the street. David, of course, in your piece, the office space and office buildings are what become reappropriated. Jill, for you, land, and Ersela and Stephen, the kind of forest becomes kind of the staging ground for reappropriation for this village. And so I'm just curious, you know, is that the operative stance of inaction, or can inaction actually occur without having something to reappropriate as its basis?
I guess I can start. I think the office tower is definitely was a prime target or an object of obsession for a lot of people because there were so many vacant buildings. But it was actually a huge number of different typologies that were involved in Holland. And also in terms of the spaces, it's really the streets where a lot of the things became visible. So I can remember photos of tanks rolling down the street, and you know, it was actually a quite intense period of conflict. So in that sense, you know, this kind of nonviolent way of doing inaction didn't actually have something to operate on. It was like people just occupying the city, and in some ways it really didn't matter what was around them, at least from the perspective that I was looking at. But then it became that much more interesting once architectural and social and political things started to come into the conversation.
Okay. From my point of view, also, like, I don't know if inaction always has to lead to this kind of reappropriation, because I imagine also a form of inaction that it's like putting things on hold, even processes of appropriation or even reappropriation. So it's creating this kind of blockades in a world where we are all the time in this kind of wheel, like a mouse following a movement, who knows why. Sometimes like just creating a disturbance or a blockage can also produce precisely a blockage of action that can be productive without the need of having to appropriate, but just opening up the possibilities of like a density of time that opens up full of possibilities.
I mean, I think we're or at least from my perspective, I'm always interested in how things are made spatial. And so maybe that's why reappropriation comes up. But I think in the work that I do, there isn't necessary. I'm more concerned with, I guess, actions that stop displacement than ones that promote reappropriation in a way. And that maybe, you know, people are happy for you to sort of reappropriate space, but at the cost of displacement. So I think, I don't know, somehow there's a relationship between those two things in my mind, but also just that, yeah, that by actually taking over space, it makes some of these inactions spatial. Like there are ways probably that the inactions are not made spatial, but maybe those are less what we're drawn to because we're interested in how the city and space is transformed. So that would be sort of one thought on that regard. I mean, I guess the other thought is like, for how long? In a way, some of these projects also point to the idea that those reappropriations are short-lived. So I don't know how effective that is as an inaction. I mean, it's something that we could think about, but I think it's effective at raising awareness, but does it actually change the course of something? I don't know. I think we're all still figuring out how to change the course of certain things.
I mean, yeah, I see part of what we're circling around is also kind of what magnitude and what scale of inaction can have this sort of trickle up effect. I mean, and I think it was sort of embodied in all of your presentations. Like I love, actually, in fact, literally, I think, Jill, your definition, and I believe your practice also centers around this term fallow, and that fallow is, almost as Lucía was describing it, more as sort of on hold, not as though something has fallen into disrepair. Like, is it not an agricultural term around a sort of pause, like a pause space between crop rotations or between crop cycles?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a pause space, and it's also a pause space that leads to future agriculture in that case, but leads to a kind of, to rendering something more reproductive or a sense of repair. And I don't know if repair is the right word, but I think reparation is interesting in that regard. Like it's a sense of having to just pause for a minute to kind of regain course. So yeah, it's and it's also not inactive. I mean, active things happen in the fallow period.
Right. And I mean, I like how you cautioned against spoiler alerts, and I think it was quite, you know, sort of hilarious how you all were both trying to not reveal too much, but at the same time also thinking, even David, about how not only was this work from the past, but it was a almost 40-year phenomenon. It would be quite interesting to revisit the squats now and think about to what degree gentrification played out, or quite interesting, I'm sure, Lucía, in terms of Harlem and thinking about some of the development that's happened in the neighborhood, you know, has really transformed it, and to think about that sort of shift. And of course, the Keystone Pipeline has had its own sort of transformations over time. My kind of pet question, I probably have repeated this question at all of our panel conversations, Neeraj, but I'm so interested to get, and it's probably my pet curiosity about the book of Takes Action, is twofold. One, to what degree, how does one teach or instrumentalize any of these things that are mostly about, I think, kind of like gonzo journalism? Like they're basically smart observations on phenomena. Like Stephen and Ursula, I love this kind of like obstructionist, interventionist, you know, energy barn, spirit camps, core planting, activist tree villages. These feel almost like tools that no one individual could conceive of, but in fact, they emerge out of necessity. They emerge out of reactions, or maybe realizing that inaction cannot occur. And I keep thinking about, like, is this something where are we too kind of, not necessarily formalist, because I think all things have forms, but are we too accepting of more sort of like predetermined or pre-engineered ways of thinking in these socio-political conditions? Or in fact is a more kind of informal, you know, like how do we shed our authorship? How does authorship play out into these kind of things? They, you know, like they're usually collectively authored. They're not single authored. So that's on the one side. And then the other side is this idea of tools. Increasingly, it seems like, and I believe, David, maybe you presented a counterpoint to master plans and was talking about almost tools. I feel all of you were almost referring to tools as being a critical way of operating in this through action, is to thinking of like small instruments, whether they're off-the-shelf tools or ready-made tools or pre-made tools, and that these are the devices that become the instruments of spatializing interventions, is not working through conventions of the market or, you know, tendering and bidding and these other kinds of conventions of practice, but instead more through tools, like things that can be deployed, things that can be scaled up, things that can be instrumentalized in a different way. Is the profession backwards? Are we teaching the wrong way? Should we be thinking about all of this totally differently? Open-ended question if anyone wants to dive in.
I think maybe quickly from our perspective, maybe tying that question to the previous one as well, for us it was probably a little less about the moment of action and the moment of appropriation, and a little bit more about the dynamic in which all of the examples serve as a kind of bait to future action, which would be sort of beyond the pale, right? And which would cause outrage, whether that's the burning of the sacred crop or the demolition of the energy barn or the demolition of the tree village. And I think that there's something in the cases that we studied anyway about sort of not only finding the space for action, but finding the time for action, and sort of being willfully ignorant of a future inevitable situation in order to occupy a kind of moment in space and time that might be able to inflect it. So without saying too much more about current willful ignorance of the future and things like transition teams that aren't getting together, I think we've seen it that it's a really effective method of basically obstruction, right? To sort of insert yourself as if the future inevitable situation is not coming. And then the tools, the tools and all of that is sort of a means to an end, if that's your goal.
Yeah, if I could maybe put in my perspective, I think for me the research was as much a precautionary tale in some ways about what to distill out of it. I did sort of mention maybe how there were a lot, like a very complicated issue. So it's not necessarily about how to, or outlining a particular way to move forward, and in some ways actually quite the opposite. So I think it does bring up good questions though about pedagogically what we're doing and how we can try to be inspired from different scenarios that are somehow not in the realm of 100% advocacy or 100%, I don't know, from a more kind of emotional place, but maybe be in a kind of analytical mode of kind of parsing out different situations.
I don't think that the discipline is going backwards. On the contrary, I think that the discipline is loosening, which might be good, because maybe becoming a discipline, it's what made it more ineffective in a way, or more disconnected from a lot of questions that appeared to belong to the outside of the discipline when they are totally traversed by an architectural potency or power, no? So in terms of the role of the architect, and also how we can think about in pedagogical frameworks, for a while I've enjoyed thinking of the architect nowadays not so much as this person that projects in the sense of sending a projectile of a model that will arrive in the future and become real, but as a kind of a spatial minstrel like these Middle Ages minstrels that went from town to town, bringing their knowledge of stories, of songs, and by doing that, they brought with them some tacit knowledges, some embodied knowledges that they had, and also, for instance, the language. So they created the commons of these different towns, like the vernacular languages in Europe emerged out of these figures. And I think that there is now a role to be played in bringing very valuable and powerful architectural knowledge about the architectural efficiency of things and of bodies, beyond what we know of a brick or a beam or things like that, but understanding that a balcony, a rooftop can have other kinds of architectural efficiency, and to bring that in that kind of anonymous, or at least more where the author is toned down, and it becomes more of a production of a knowledge that becomes a commons, no? A spatial knowledge that it's shared and that it's brought and shared in different experiences that like the ones that we've seen today.
I think, I mean, if I could key into what Jill was talking about also, I think it's really fascinating to think about the idea of tools in land use and the kind of creativity that we've seen today. It's really fascinating to me. So I think maybe, you know, more of that kind of creativity in terms of how we deal with really immediate concerns. And, you know, when I was watching her presentation, I was thinking about the flow of materials through a city, but also, you know, land as being one of those things that flow through people's hands urbanistically as a kind of natural process, which, you know, obviously sometimes becomes quite problematic, but it's almost this kind of necessary natural process that I got the feeling when I was watching Jill's presentation.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to articulate this very well, I think, but in terms, I mean, I do think there's a shift. And also, I mean, I think landscape architecture as a discipline has always had a slightly different relationship to authorship, just because the material is living, and in a way you're sort of, I don't know, directing a process that you hope will happen, you know, 50 years out maybe, and whether that makes sense or not, I don't know, but there's still plenty of authorship and claims within that. And I do feel like there is a shift with that, but I also think that we need to be, I don't know, realistic or something. I mean, something that troubles me at the moment is that there's legislation in Detroit to, you know, demolish more buildings. And in a way, we're still demolishing buildings with no kind of plans, and we're still kind of displacing people even, and, you know, it feels like, but the, you know, the building is falling down, it needs, you know, it's a safety hazard. And I feel like all these things that are kind of thought of as safety hazards aren't, I don't know, it's just a question. I feel like I'm in a weird moment in history where I'm like, is this what it felt like in the, you know, I don't know, 50s, when people were considering wiping out all these large swaths of city, and then, you know, 50 years later, we can't really understand how you could do something like that. Or even with our politics, I wonder, I'm like, I'm sitting outside eating my dinner, and is this like a coup or not? I don't know. It's just like a funny moment where you're like, okay, this is my on the ground feeling, but am I like, how would history view where I am now, and how does that sort of reflect on what my view is of the past? And so yes, the scale is different, but in a certain way, these kind of processes happen. And I'm also interested in these contexts where, you know, the claim is that there is no money, which, you know, there is no money, but at the same time, like, people spent $500,000 putting boulders on the highway as a safety precaution to, you know, evict a homeless population of, you know, 10 people that were, so I mean, or they're spending $500,000 mowing properties, which makes sense. Like, people want the property next to them cared for, but like, there's this sort of, I don't know, I think just there's more of a mode of interrogating our preconceptions and practices, I think, that come out in these ideas of action. And perhaps also something I think as a discipline, maybe it's to your projectile comment in a sense, like, I think we're taught to kind of defend our projects, which is great. Like, we want to have hope and optimism in what we're doing, but we're like, and if this and this happens, like, this is what's going to be the end. And I think we just want to step ourselves back a little bit from that. And so I also see more opportunities of people thinking about pilots or thinking about feedback loops or kind of more short-term evaluations, which I think is a positive, I don't know if positive, but is a direction that we can take. And so also to the question of like, these are the small actions that when, like if I put this up, people will be outraged when they tear it down. It's like, it's an interesting kind of way of projecting.
Thank you. Just a reminder to anyone in the audience that feel free to put any questions for our esteemed panelists into the Q&A, and we'll probably be shifting to that as soon as we get some questions there. So feel free to add those right now. And maybe just as those questions pour in, just a last question from my side. I'm just curious if y'all have reflected on the role of visibility or invisibility in your particular projects and how that affects action. It seems like, Lucía, you go from the invisible interior and then you have this kind of threshold space where certain things are made visible onto the street. David, I know squatting is often very invisible, and that's part of its kind of strength, is being invisible and harder to detect. And Jill, it was interesting you using the air conditioning example on the street where, you know, it's visibly there, but whether it does what we want it to do is invisible. And that, you know, becomes really the tricky part of the land discussion. And finally, Ersela and Stephen, I see both the pipeline, you know, the pipeline's both visible and invisible, oftentimes underground and completely, you see the easement or sort of signs of it. But the tree city is obviously very visible and kind of put into the air and kind of has a clear kind of signage to it. And I'm just curious about those different ways of operating both visibly and invisibly and what roles those might play.
Well, if I could maybe refer to the other essay about Marconi. I mean, those towers became sort of the monuments of the sort of failures of being able to predict, you know, the necessities or resources needed for the city. And then the other example is maybe the silo becoming a monument, this kind of self-made monument, in contrast to the traditional monument where, you know, that's kind of delivered to the people by the, you know, by the people in power, versus one that's sort of evolving over time and constantly changing and even disappearing and leaving its remnants behind. So I think those are some interesting, more visible versions, but obviously you know, a lot of work was finding the invisible ones. Those tended to be a lot more interesting sometimes.
I think what we and really are interested in with the pipeline research and just the broader research of our practice of this idea of rendering the invisible visible, but really by obstructioning in some way, or if you think of the protests, the Tree Village protests, or as Neeraj, you mentioned, when the pipeline is fully constructed and operational is completely invisible, but it becomes visible when plant life, when it breaks or when it spills, right? When animals around it start to die, or when plant life around it, right, through flights of helicopters are noticed. So that could be months after a spill has happened. And this idea of like obstructioning is a way to maybe to make visible the issues of that infrastructure. And in general, maybe this also ties back to Mason's earlier comment about the discipline. I feel that if the discipline is at a moment of reckoning, and in the face of such rapid climate destruction, that we no longer have the privilege of understanding things as invisible, right? Like we choose for them to be invisible to us, right? That they're in our face right now. And so if we can really think more or redirect the discipline's vision towards obstructioning and towards perhaps highlighting these kinds of failures, then we can do away with the privilege of time where a finished vision is presented, and we hope that, in hopes that that vision is executed. I think there's a real urgency, and we're running out of time in visioneering, and I think it's mostly right now time for obstacling.
I mean, it's interesting how I think we get a range of contributions in the book around how overt actions can or should be, and how sometimes covert, the power in covert action. This came up on a number of other panels. And I mean, I think that's something that's present in these talks. And actually, Lucy, I was looking up a little bit more about some of the work you've been doing recently. I know you've been looking a lot at secrecy and clandestine actions. And Ersela and Stephen, you've had a book that's come out recently about some of the sort of larger ideas on military, I guess, military spatial complex. And David, I know you've been working on a lot of housing projects lately. I wonder if you all might reflect a little bit on how, not necessarily this work, but how action or forms of action are playing out in some of your larger projects. Either it's a more sustained research project beyond, or that builds upon some of the foundations of this contribution to the Takes Action book, but maybe within sort of more sustained projects, how that might play out. I don't know, thinking of either ongoing work or recently completed work. It'd be great to hear you speak a little bit about tying some of that into to that recent work. Everyone's so kind, so everyone starts up silently, but feel free to interrupt each other in Zoom space. I know interrupting in Zoom doesn't happen anymore.
I think I can link the Neeraj's question with this one. I think the question of the visible invisible is quite important. It was both in the article from Takes Action, but it's also important in my current research. It's true that I'm working on this idea of clandestinity and the underground as a form of spatial production, of minor spatial production. And in fact, in that article, I've mentioned Ralph Ellison, and Ralph Ellison has this book, The Invisible Man. There we have this idea of when the book begins, I'm invisible because you refuse to see me. And we see throughout that book how he articulates his visibility and invisibility, and there are moments that that invisibility can be turned into an asset. No? And I think that that's something quite interesting to keep in mind in a moment where there is like we are under a regime of extreme visibility, like everything needs to be illuminated, located, and placed in a specific geolocation and time stamp, etc. So in that situation, I do believe that the creation of nowheres, as I was mentioning, of spaces of darkness. So understanding that architecture can now become not only an articulation of a building, but an articulation of this regime of visibility, of what can be visible and what can retain some possibilities of action. Because precisely in these realms of darkness and invisibility, there is potentialities, because when you have something perfectly illuminated and perfectly visible, you see the edges of that figure become like high resolution edges. And instead, I think that there is an interest in fuzzy images, fuzzy figures that have a vibrancy that means that there is a possibility open there. So I think that precisely like safeguarding and creating spaces of fuzziness, of not precise vision of either the state or technology, etc. It's always interesting. I think it can be an interesting way of understanding the idea of minor architecture.
Yeah, I think I can mention this housing project for youths with the Habitat for Humanity in Korea, and somehow we can't forget Neeraj's question about hidden and non-hidden, sort of conflate that with Neeraj, Mason's question. But yeah, youths being maybe a very invisible and marginalized group, but surprisingly large. And so dealing with important issues in the contemporary I think is very important. So that's a project. And then a book that we're working on for what we're calling Small Island Disappearing States, where a lot of really small nation islands are disappearing due to climate change. And in some ways they're invisible, and they will be disappearing in different ways in the future.
I think we've been able to engage directly with notions of vision and visibility as they relate to the securitized atmosphere of the U.S.-Mexico border. We practice and teach and live on the border between El Paso and Juarez, West Texas, and what's been interesting there is to understand both the global scale of the military vision and the eye, viewing this kind of binational territory in terms of national security interests, but also understanding environmental and infrastructural neglect and damage through literally tracing the movement of dust in the air as a way to kind of make visible patterns that start to talk about a watershed model of a border rather than a line. And so for us, we've been able in these past 5 years to really just kind of like live in the air and think about the invisibility of surveillance systems and the visibility of the kind of the geologic matter that swirls around, and how that geologic matter, when it's really dusty, it impedes the visibility of the security apparatus, and how that can become a covert way for migration. And so those are all sort of issues on the table for us.
I have a lot of issues on the table, but I think one thing that I've been thinking about related to the invisible, visible question is maybe just really actually understanding the flows of capital and the tools of capital with the, I've been interested in addressing abandoned property for probably 2 decades, but I feel like I'm still shocked, I guess, by the sort of production of the condition, and perhaps as a forms of thinking about how we can act, just having people understand that people are still being evicted even if there's no housing market, and properties are being sold, and capital is flowing in very covert ways. And I think there's this weird conception that it's like an individual's foreclosure, a bunch of individual, like there are a bunch of individual lots, and therefore it's like a bunch of individual decisions and responsibilities where it really isn't. And so I think just interrogating those, and then maybe to the question of action, I guess I was serious when I thought, like, right now I think of any time in my professional career, at least, I'm interested in more direct action. And so I think that is also finding people who are doing amazing things on the ground, and how we can actually support that in a way. And it also ties maybe to that question of authorship. Like I don't really need credit. I don't know if I'm going to like show this great image, but just to kind of support people who are holding property for the future, and that isn't something that is it's tenuous, and how could we reduce the maintenance costs, or something, like very, very simple things that could have large effects, that could maybe redirect some of these flows that are basically tearing apart the communities with the least resources already, with the highest populations of minority or inhabitants, with so how could you actually I think that would feel like a good action point, regardless of I don't know, other forms of outcome. So I think how we sort of how we collaborate, and who are collaborations. I think it's interesting. I've heard more about projects of people, suing the city, and architects and lawyers being involved, or geographers, and kind of uncovering some of these malpractices. So I think that's an interesting action forward.
I wonder if, since we have a nice kind of intimate crew here, and maybe some people's questions I recognize might be kind of tedious to type out, if there's anyone who would like to be recognized, maybe you can just say you have a question in the chat, and I think we can activate your microphone. or at least Nini, Aiden, or Sarah can help us do so. So if you do, just say me in the chat and we'll make sure to pass it over to you. Otherwise, I think, are there some, I don't know if there's some final thoughts from our guests or top areas or of interest. I mean, Jill, it's interesting to, I mean, I think we're all for action. I don't think the inaction topic was really to put in place of saying to no, but I think I kind of like this characterization being made around, I think you've each kind of touched on it in different ways, but I think this, like, I really love this minor bodies making minor architecture comment, and this users as creators. And you yourself, Jill, abandoned land still performs is your comment, and this kind of more obstructionist as a form of empowerment. I think these are, for me, these all fit within a kind of covert forms of inaction that are subtle, but definitely impactful. Yeah, any other final thoughts from our guests who have made time to present today?
Well, just a quick thought that actually maybe one of the most powerful ways to enact change is through the kind of peaceful protest or variance on that kind of like creative ways to do that. So I do feel like, you know, at first when I saw the prompt of inaction, I had the same reaction of, you know, why am I in this inaction category? But you know, when you think about it, historically, that is the best way to enact large change is through this kind of en masse way of collectively doing something in a peaceful and sometimes creative manner. So I think that was really nice to see how that played out in everyone's project today.
Well, I think it's been a great afternoon or evening. You can see the light's slowly been going down on me here. I don't have another light on in this room. I'm slowly fading into darkness. But I see Lucia's in the same situation. Only other people have light on their faces. It's been great spending the afternoon with you on and here today. And I think closing out this series, Neeraj, it's been such an enjoyable way to kind of capitalize on our inability to have a proper book launch and instead just really celebrate the content and bring the authors in this case forward in their incredible projects. It's great to kind of give new air to this. I think your projects, your scholarship on these topics, I think they have a kind of durability to them such that they aren't dated necessarily 2016 or whatever date you want to put on them. They have a kind of durability to that, which I think comes through in your captivating presentations. But I think we're ready to wrap up here, Neeraj.
Just to second Mason's comment, thank you so much for making time to be here today and for all the audience members partaking in the chat today. It's been really inspiring to see all the work you guys are doing, both that was in bracket, but also that you continue to do. So thank you all. And I think moving on to just wrapping up, we at CCA, if you're curious about the events left in our semester, please visit scaffold.architecture.cca.edu. Our next event, as was mentioned earlier, will be Urbanism Beyond Corona. The first part of that event is at 9 a.m. Pacific time on Monday, and there will be an evening keynote talk at 6 p.m. Pacific time by Giovanna Barassi from what we call the other CCA.
And same with us, you can see our website for our remaining talks and lectures. We have one tomorrow, a fantastic talk called For Her Record, Notes on the Work of Blanche Lemko van Ginkel, that will feature another CCA important figure, Phyllis Lambert, Mary McLeod, Ipek Mehmetoglu, and Laura Miller and Bridget Shim will be moderating that event, celebrating the contributions of Blanche to the field of architecture. That is at 5:30 p.m. Other than that, I think it is a full wrap. Thanks so much, David, Jill, Ersela, Stephen, and Lucia. Neeraj, great to see you. And everyone have yourself a great evening and afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been great.
Great to see you.